Thank all of you for joining me today. I feel like sometimes outside media, when they're from the coast, don't understand what's happening everywhere else. So they come in and try to say what's happening without giving people space to talk. So I wanted to make sure we had space here to talk. If you could just say your name and what you do activism-wise so that the viewers will know later.
I'm Erin Maye Quade, sheher, hers. So I'm Black biracial. I'm a lifelong native Minnesota resident. I've lived here my whole life. I was a state representative. I was elected in 2016. And I was the third, well, Ilhan and I were tied as the third and fourth Black woman ever elected to the state legislature. I was the first Black person ever elected outside of the city of Minneapolis, St. Paul. And now in my role, I'm not in the legislature anymore. I'm the advocacy director at a legal and advocacy nonprofit called Gender Justice. And then I also run a public education campaign and coalition called Unrestrict Minnesota, where we're seeking to remove the abortion restrictions from law.
First, my name is Ron Harris. I've been on the ground organizing for quite a while in the Twin Cities. I used to work for this organization called Neighborhoods Organizing for Change, which was on the front lines for when Jamar Clark was killed. We advocated for anti-police brutality measures, ending low-level offenses at the city, working on a lot of criminal justice reform. And today I'm deeply involved with the National Democratic Party, so really more focused on electoral politics, but certainly, electoral politics is intersectional and impacts us in major ways.
I have grown up here. I'm a Korean adoptee. I have lived in this city for most of my life. I started an organization called New Leaders Council here 6 years ago, which is an organization that is committed to advancing equity in the region and doing it across industries and sectors with the goal that we can get really incredible progressive folks in all of these industries and sectors, and they can call on each other to get things done. And now I work for a large healthcare organization that's based in the city.
I am mixed race, Latinx and Black. My parents are immigrants from islands in the Caribbean. I was actually born and raised right on Lake Street, so being on the ground, going to help clean up, it made me cry because it's like that's where I grew up. That's where I call home.
Nationwide, it feels like Minneapolis has sort of set the stage for America and become a symbol of what's going on in the country. How do you feel like we got here?
Minnesota, if you ask Minnesotans, we are really, really proud to be from here. We have a lot of Minnesota exceptionalism. Prince said, the cold keeps the bad people out, right? We love our state. And I would say and I'll look to Minnesotans to affirm this, but 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, we started talking about the racial disparities in Minnesota. We have some of the highest racial disparities in the nation when it comes to educational outcomes, wealth, income, healthcare outcomes, employment, unemployment. And so that conversation really took off, I really feel 6 years ago. And I think part of how we got here was the activists and the organizers who have been on the ground. I mean, to go from 2014, from that summer when Michael Brown was murdered, to now, to be able to wear your Black Lives Matter shirt in public, for people to have that, I mean, that is the work of organizing and activism that has been led particularly by Black women and femmes and queer people. And I think it is real. I mean, that is how we got to this moment. And I'm calling this moment of where we know that systemic change is possible, because that is the moment I'm identifying.
And when you look at policing and how we overfund the police and over-police Black communities and communities of color, what does that say about our values and how those values in that brutality and racism killed George Floyd and so many others?
White supremacy is an institution with legally funded strategies to protect it. That is how we have over-policing and funding for policing. The solutions that need to happen have existed. People have done the research. There have been policy solutions, there have been demonstrations, there have been sit-ins, there have been walkouts and protests. But we got here because we still in this country and in this state have valued upholding white supremacy more than we have valued equity, more than we have valued Black lives. And I really, truly think that this is a moment where we have the ability to stop doing that.
At the city of Minneapolis, spends $200 million per year on MPD budget, on the police budget, right? Which is about a quarter of our revenues at the city, a quarter of the revenues in the city. And I think what that tells us is we've always valued order over justice, that really the key to public safety so far has been law enforcement, that the city hasn't really been creative enough about how do we keep the community safe without overly relying on law enforcement, right? How do we keep the community safe with community policing models, or investing in community organizations that can cover parts of a policeman's job, right? We may not want police to show up at a mental health crisis. We might want an actual social worker to show up at a mental health crisis, or a chemical counselor to show up at some of those crises, right? And I think that comes about because, one, people have been afraid to actually question the role of policing and question the history of policing, and have not really been interested or curious enough to figure out what are some alternative measures of policing. I think, two, kind of in the question of how we got here, Minneapolis-St. Paul has the worst racial disparities across the country in pretty much every single measurable way, whether it's education, access to jobs, access to social or political power. Go down the list with how inequitable this place is. And so when you have an undercurrent of inequity for so long, combined with the fact that the city has been faced with at least 6 police-involved shootings of unarmed Black people since 2013, right? So you have the undercurrent, and then you do a lot of work to pass implicit bias training and de-escalation tactics, and implement body cams, right? Diversifying the police academy so we get more officers of color or non-white officers into the force, and none of that saved George Floyd's life, right? So that's why I think this moment is looking the way that it looks, that it's like we check down the list, we've done those things, and yet it has not contributed to better outcomes for people of color as it relates to policing.
We had this, I don't know, I like to call it a small breath of air when all 4 officers were charged. But charges aren't justice. That's a first step. Something happens when we talk about policing, and in the police culture, policing means power, but it's supposed to mean, like you said, public safety, protection. You gave a lot of great solutions, Ron. I want to know what some of you want to see happen next. Like, what's the next step?
They're not even solutions, because we did that stuff already, and yet it hasn't worked, right? Next step has to be demilitarizing the police. I think that just even having those weapons and having that armor, I think it gets into your psyche. It really does. I can't come up with the psychological studies, but I'm sure that having that stuff, when you get the chance to use it, you want to use it. Can we defund the police and use that $200 million towards all the on-the-ground organizations that have shown up this week, who are showing up with food and providing people with transportation and keeping their own blocks safe overnight when they don't trust, the National Guard on the ground?
That's something that they don't show on TV, that people don't talk about. And I think it's really important that people understand that this is a community and they are wrapping their arms around each other.
It's one of the reasons why people love Minneapolis and St. Paul so much. And I think now we are really starting to see that we are interdependent and that we are capable of self-organizing to be able to, yes, provide the basic things that we all need, but also to be there for comfort and for joy, and to be able to try and identify where we go from this moment. And so, as you have mentioned, there's a lot of different things that have happened, all the way from, policing block by block and setting up night watches, to organizing medics and EMTs and donation drives and, cleanups. All of these things are really, I think, it elevates, again, the beauty of what's already been here about Minneapolis and St. Paul, and now we're just seeing it a little bit more.
After Jamar Clark was killed by police in 2015, there was an occupation outside that precinct for like 18 days in December and January in Minnesota. And it was the same thing. Part of the reason the occupation lasted for so long is because when it went away, resources and food and community was going to go away for folks. And the community has shown up and continues to show up for each other.
I understand I am the media, but I am not above critique. And I'm part of a business that I feel like is unfair sometimes. As people who are on the ground, how would you like to see the media better approach talking about protest and change and inequality?
to see an image in my head and have memories of like a wonderful childhood, and then to see something completely different on the television screen, I'm like, that isn't my Lake Street. And then to hear that people are so reduced to either like rioters, looters, protesters, and not seeing what they really are. Of like, we've been told time and time again of going through these systems of make sure to vote, stay tuned to these systems, and they never really worked. So I think it gets to your first question of how did we get here? Of we've been trying, we've been new, we've been doing it and nothing's changed. It's a cycle that continues again and again. So seeing it on television as like, so it's infuriating, it's heartbreaking, but there's this like sense of pride too, of I'm so proud that where I call home is having this uprising, this awakening that they're not going to allow for this cycle to continue. So to get to your question of what we would like to see is like, when you see all those plastered up like wood boards, they're covered in beautiful art. It's like, look at all these Black and brown artists who are here showing their support. It's like when you go to that sacred intersection, you know, there's just love. There's so much food, all the cooks, there's literal child care. It's like there's so much love there, and I don't feel like that love is being radiated across the screen in the way that I felt it growing up there.
I also think about the report that came out right after George Floyd was murdered from the police, and it was he died of a medical incident. And if it hadn't been for a Black teenager filming that encounter, filming his murder, we wouldn't actually know the truth. And then how often we still report and take at word what law enforcement is saying about what is happening, which is just terrifying. Alongside the uprising, there are people who are working to devolve what is happening in order to accomplish an end goal. And white nationalist terrorism, white supremacist terrorism is on the rise, and yet we still struggle to talk about it. We use cute words like outsiders, when we actually don't mean outsiders. We just mean people who have a totally different agenda, who are from this community, but have a different agenda. So those are some of the things that I really struggle with, because it's dangerous to not say what it is and to do the work of folks who don't share our movement goals, to hide that in headlines and in words.
To Erin's point, it has evolved into something that is not the intent of justice for George Floyd. When I'm talking about community policing and people setting up watch block by block, it is to watch for white supremacists. It's to find the bottles that are filled with gas that they know that they're stashing there to come back later and light on fire. Like, that's not a simplified headline of protest and looter. That's something very, very different that I do not think anybody outside of Minnesota truly understands in conversation with my friends that are international or even in other states.
Some of you over and over again have talked about being proud to be from here. Can you each share one reason why you're so proud to be a Minnesotan and an American? I think about Toni Morrison and how she said, all the rest of us have to hyphenate. You know, only white people get to be American. The rest of us have to hyphenate. So when I have these conversations, I like to drive home that, you know, like Langston Hughes said, we too are America and beautiful.
My parents chose this place in particular for my brother and I. It's like, it's a promise of no matter where you're coming from, no matter the circumstance, it's like, you can, whatever you want to be, you get to be that. And so it brings tears to my eyes and makes me emotional, because it's like, I still believe that like that promise can be held, of regardless of seeing all this tragedy, it's like, we can still have that. And so that makes me so proud of it's like something we're forever working toward.
It's such a complicated question. You know, part of what makes me proud to be a Minnesotan, this is just like a really specific thing that popped into my mind. You know, it's Pride Month. I'm queer, and we were one of the first states to include protections in our Human Rights Act for gender identity and gender expression. It makes me really proud that we thought of that. To be an American, you know, it's so funny to see the contradictions in the ideals laid out in our founding. and then the actions that were taken that went directly against it. But if you separate those things out, if you look at just what the ideal was, what was the goal, what was the intent, I am behind that. I am for that. And it is, as someone who was a politician, it was really helpful to like pull people back to, no, the whole point was, right, equality, equity for everybody. And then we did a whole bunch of work to make sure that didn't happen. And when we stopped doing things that were overt, like enslaving people or Jim Crow, it didn't stop what was happening. We haven't undone the harm. We have to undo the harm, and we have to dismantle the systems that were built to do exactly what is happening right now and build them the way that we actually want to have them. I think we are a unique state, certainly, to set the blueprint of what can be. I absolutely think that Minnesota is the place where you are going to see the radical dismantling of white supremacy within our systems and the rebuilding of them that are equitable and inclusionary. I think it's going to be work. I think it's going to be uncomfortable, especially for the white folks in the state, which I believe is like 80%. But I believe we can do it.
For as devastating as this moment is, for enraging as this moment is, all I have to do is walk outside and to be with my people, to recognize that I really do think we have the right people here to start to figure out what comes next and to rebuild our city. And to Erin's point, become an example across the country of what is possible. I mean, I look at our elected leadership and I feel proud of who we have in office, right? I look at the organizations that are here, the people that are here doing the work, and I feel proud of who those folks are. And so I feel like, yes, for as many problems as we have, again, it just really comes down to like, who is here? Who is the makeup of this state? And I trust us to figure out what comes next.
I think this was the only city that would have sparked a 50-state protest the way that it did. Right? For both negative and positive reasons, right? Negative because of all the underlying inequities, but positive because we have a culture of activism, we have a culture of organizing. I still would argue that on the ground, we have one of the most organized communities in the entire country. From the direct actions to, again, people coming together, to sharing resources. I think that we get a lot of our shared community from our roots as a state, right? Where it was super cold and those Swedes had a band together, you know what I mean? And that has kind of translated itself forward.
For all of the white people who are in Ask a Black Friend mode, what advice do you have for them?
How much time we got?
I can help with this too, yeah.
I came to this realization, in the last couple of weeks. I'm like, I am way too many people's only Black friend. Way too many.
Same.
And while I'm very excited about the fact that this is, Memorial Day 2020 has been the entry point for so many as it relates to activism and waking up to this. The advice that I would give is, y'all done spent the last 10 weeks learning how to bake bread, grow your own rhubarb, do your own at-home improvement projects. Use those same resources to figure out how to be a white ally, right? And recognize the fact that when you ask a Black man in particular during this time who just got re-traumatized from seeing another video of somebody dying with a body like mine, when you ask them to do the work for you to help you become a better version or to be a better activist or what have you, that's emotional labor, right? That I only have enough emotional labor to keep myself sane and to keep myself protected and to do my part in making sure this never happens again. You got to do your part as the majority population to also use your privilege to find those resources.
And the revolution has always been and always will be intersectional. And certain people have always been erased despite leading those movements. So before we end, I want to talk about the importance of intersectionality.
I too am buoyed by the fact that it's starting to feel like all Black lives matter, right? Black trans lives matter, Black queer lives matter. We're starting to see that more upfront and more honored. And we're also starting to see a lot of allies, non-white allies, who are also addressing anti-Blackness within their own community right now. They're taking advantage of this moment to get their people correct.
Queer Black women and femmes have been the people who have been leading these movements because they sit at the intersection of all those marginalized identities. And so following their lead, making sure we center them and their leadership, I think is the most important thing we can continue to do. That is true, certainly for movements of the past, and it is true here in Minnesota.
It's Pride Month. It's like this Stonewall was a riot. Like the ones that started it are queens. I think for me personally, I'm like, that was the bedrock of it all for me, of like, that is an uprising. So to see now we're having ours right here at home, I'm like, that's why we must have it be intersectional. There's no way it can't be.
And I think as someone who is not Black, who is not Indigenous, who has proximity to whiteness, but experiences the world as an Asian woman, yeah, my liberty is completely bound to all of yours and everybody else's. And we got to do this work. And I'm ready, you know, and I hope that we all can make what we need out of this moment to sit in the discomfort and then to move forward.
Thank you, my collection of comrades. May us all start the fires of freedom together. Thanks for having me. Thanks for speaking with me. Thank you.
So good to meet
you
so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.